Let's talk about WAHDATUL WUJUD. In English, it's roughly the oneness of being. It's one of those ideas that sounds incredibly deep, and honestly, a lot of people find it super complex, maybe even confusing. But what if the big secret behind it is that it's actually simple? Today, we're going to try and clear away some of that mental fog and see what's really there. And yeah, that's really the big question here, isn't it? How can something that might be fundamentally simple get so twisted and complicated in our minds? And maybe more to the point, why do we have such a hard time with it? All right, so to get to the bottom of this, let's start with why it feels so complicated. Because it turns out the problem might not be the idea itself. The real roadblock, well, it might be a little closer to home. And here it is, the core insight. The problem isn't the concept. The real difficulty is us. It's our own mental habits, the way our brains are trained to look at the world. The complexity isn't out there in the ether. It's something we're bringing to the party. Okay, to really see this in action, let's look at a fantastic example. We're going to take a single verse from the Quran and see how it can be understood in two completely, radically different ways. Now check this out. This is fascinating. The common way to read this verse is as a command. Your Lord has commanded that you not worship except him. It's a rule, right? Something you have to follow. But then you have the mystic Ibn Arabi, and he flips it on its head. He says, no, it's not a command. It's a statement of fact. Your Lord has established that you cannot worship except him. You see that tiny shift in wording? It's a massive difference. One's an instruction manual, the other is a description of how reality works. And that second way of reading it, wow, it has some pretty radical implications. I mean, if it's literally impossible to worship anything but the divine, then it reframes, well, everything. It means that every single act of devotion, no matter how it looks on the outside, even something like worshiping a stone, is really just an expression of that same single universal drive to connect with what's real. Okay, so if the idea can be that clear, what's the holdup? Why is it still so tricky for most of us to really get it? Well, this brings us to the real diagnosis. It's a problem with our mindset. It's like we're all walking around in a kind of mental fog. And there's a name for this, cognitive bias. The source basically describes it as a mental fog that just obscures simple truths. And it's this fog that makes us overcomplicate everything. And the crazy part is, we don't even know we're doing it. So why does this fog even exist? Well, think about it. Our everyday lives are all about complexity, conditions, and if-then statements. Everything is relative. Our brains are just so wired for that kind of thinking that when we come face to face with a simple, absolute, universal truth, it just feels weird. It feels foreign, almost too simple to be real, and our brains kind of short-circuit. To make this crystal clear, there's a brilliant little analogy that helps break it all down, and it's all about something as simple as rain and an umbrella. So let's start with a fundamental, undeniable fact of the universe. If it rains, you will get wet. The nature of rain is to make things wet. Super simple, right? Nobody's going to argue with that. But then our overthinking brain immediately jumps in. It says, hold on a second. If I use an umbrella, I don't get wet. And on the surface, that sounds like it completely contradicts the basic fact we just agreed on. And here it is. This is the aha moment. The umbrella doesn't change the nature of rain one bit. Rain is still wet. That fundamental truth is completely untouched. All the umbrella does is introduce a new condition, a new context. It just shifts the topic from the reality of rain to the circumstance of you staying dry. And that is exactly what we do with these big ideas. We get so hung up on the umbrellas that we forget about the rain. And that's really the whole point of this. It's about learning how to see the fundamental thing, the rain itself, and not get so distracted by all the circumstantial umbrellas that we put up to complicate things. So let's boil this all down. What should we take away from this? First, the core idea here is a simple statement of reality. It's not some complex rule you have to follow. Second, all that confusion we feel, it comes from our own mental fog, that habit of overthinking. And that means, third, that understanding isn't about more complex theories. It's just about a simple shift in how we look at things. And finally, we have to learn to see the fundamental truth, the rain, and separate it from all the contexts, the umbrellas that surround it. And this leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. If our minds can so easily complicate a beautiful, profound idea like this one, what other simple truths might we be missing every single day? What other realities are just sitting there, right in front of us, hidden only by our own habit of looking for the complicated maze instead of the straight path? Have you ever stopped to think about how a simple declaration of faith could actually hide a deep philosophical paradox? Well, today we're diving headfirst into the Kalimat's Tawhid, the Islamic declaration of God's oneness. We're going to uncover a truly mind-bending interpretation that makes you question the very nature of worship and who is actually worshiping whom. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with a specific command right from the Quran. Then we'll explore 3 different interpretations that create this incredible puzzle. From there, we'll face the paradox head-on, try to solve it by looking at consciousness, and finally, hopefully, uncover a much deeper meaning behind worship, will, and love. So everything we're about to unpack, it all starts with one single, powerful command from the Quran. Now, at first glance, it seems pretty straightforward. But this verse is the launch pad for this entire fascinating investigation. And here it is. And your Lord has commanded that you worship none but him. Seems simple, right? A clear instruction. But that little phrase, worship none but him, that's where we start to go down a really interesting philosophical rabbit hole. Because when you look closer at that command, it opens up all these different layers of meaning. And this is where it gets really fun, because some of these interpretations seem to completely contradict each other. So check this out. Here's the first big twist. The command, worship none but him, can be read not just as an instruction to us, but as a statement of absolute reality. The idea that in the entire universe, there is nothing that truly worships other than him. Let's break that down a bit more.
Okay, so here's where you can really see the puzzle taking shape. The first interpretation, that's the standard one we all know. No God except Allah. Simple enough. The second one follows right along. Nothing is worshipped except Allah. I mean, if he's the only God, he's the only one worthy of worship. Makes sense. But then, look at number 3. None who worship except Allah. Wait a second. If God is the only one actually doing the worshiping, then how can we be commanded to worship him? That's the paradox.
And boom, we've hit the core of it. The worshipper's paradox, this tension, this logical knot, it forces us to ask some much, much deeper questions about consciousness, about existence, and about what worship even is. See, this whole paradox hinges on a really profound idea, that if God's consciousness is the only one that truly and absolutely exists, then any action, any thought, any feeling of worship that we experience has to, at its ultimate source, come from that one single divine consciousness. Which, of course, brings us to this absolutely staggering question. If the worshiper is God, and the one being worshipped is God, who is actually worshiping whom? Now, I know, it feels like an impossible loop, right? But the solution isn't to just throw up our hands and say the premise is wrong. It's about getting a little more nuanced and understanding that there are 2 fundamentally different kinds of consciousness at play here. The key to unlocking this whole puzzle is right here. On one side, you have God's supreme consciousness. It's absolute, it's the source of everything, it exists completely on its own. And then on the other side, you have our consciousness. And here's the critical part. It's not a piece of God's consciousness. It's a totally separate creation that is completely dependent on his will to even exist. Our awareness is here only because he wills it to be. And once you really get that distinction, the whole idea of worship just transforms. It's not a paradox anymore. Instead, it starts to reveal a much deeper purpose, one that's rooted in will and ultimately in love. So this reframes everything. Worship isn't God worshiping himself. No way. It's his will creating beings with their own separate consciousness so that his glory can be known through them. The act of worship, then, becomes this path that he designed, a process for the worshiper to begin to understand divine love. It's purely an expression of his will, not some kind of demand for praise. And that leads to one final, crucial insight. From this viewpoint, it's literally impossible for God to need or ask for our worship. Why? Because his own praise is already absolute, already complete within his own being. So the act of worship, it has to exist entirely for the benefit of the creation, not the creator. So this leaves us with a final question, something to really chew on. If worship isn't some transactional duty, but a path that was willed into existence to help us understand divine love, How does that change what it all means for you? All right, today we're jumping headfirst into a really deep and honestly pretty mind-bending philosophical idea. It's known as WAHDATUL WUJUD, which basically translates to the unity of being. So let's just cut right to the chase. This whole concept boils down to one wild, startling question. If we accept that only God has true, absolute existence, then what about you? Do you even exist? Okay, so where do we even begin with this? Well, the foundation, the very starting point of this whole philosophy, is actually a pretty simple but incredibly powerful idea. Only God has what you could call true existence. The key word you gotta know is wujud. Now, this isn't just, being there, like a chair in a room. Wujud means something much, much bigger. It's true, absolute, one-of-a-kind existence. And the core of this concept is that this quality, this wujud, belongs only to God. Nobody and nothing else has it. But as soon as you accept that first point, you hit a wall. A huge logical problem pops up right away. It's a paradox, and we really need to figure it out. So here's the thing. If God has ade mutlak, that's absolute existence, then logically, everything else, the whole universe, you, me, everything, we must be the complete opposite, tiada mutlak, or absolute non-existence. It's one or the other, black and white, with zero gray area. And that is the paradox. Think about it. If creation is absolute non-existence, just total nothingness, then how could it ever have come into being? You can't just make something out of a true, complete void. It just doesn't make sense. It's a flat-out contradiction. So, to get around this, the whole philosophy has to get a bit more sophisticated. That simple either-or idea isn't going to cut it. We need a more subtle way to think about what to be even means. And the solution, really, is all about the words we use. That simple existence versus non-existence framework, it's just not sharp enough to get the job done. We need new terms and new way of looking at it. And this is where the big shift happens. Instead of calling God absolutely existent, we start calling God Naya, which means real. The absolute, original cause of everything. And then everything else, all of creation, is called Ada, or existent. But here's the catch. It's only existent in a relative way. So let's break that down, because this is super important. The real, that's God, has always been and always will be, the ultimate source. But the existent, that's us, we have a starting point. We came from a state of not being. So what does that mean? It means our existence isn't our own. It's totally 100% dependent on the one who is real. We're not here on our own steam. Okay, I know this is all pretty abstract, so to make it a little easier to grasp, people often use an analogy. The thing is, this analogy is also where a lot of folks get it wrong. Let's talk about ice sculptures. All right, just imagine this. You've got all these amazing ice sculptures. There's a car, a person, a plane, all these different shapes. They all look different, but what are they all made of? Right. They all come from the same single source, water. Now, a really common mistake is to look at that ice car and say, hey, this is water. And if you follow that logic, then worshiping the sculpture is basically the same as worshiping the water itself. But no, that's not right. That's the big misunderstanding. The sculpture isn't water, it's a formation of water. The shape, the car, is totally different from the substance, the essence. And that distinction is absolutely crucial. The form is just a manifestation, it's not the source itself. And you can probably see why this is such a big deal. If you mix up the form and the essence, you land on this idea called pantheism, the belief that God is everything. And that would mean worshiping, say, a tree or a rock is the same as worshiping God, which is not the point here at all. So if we're not made from the stuff of God, then how in the world did we get here? And that brings us to the final and honestly the most important piece of this entire puzzle. First things first, we have to admit something. Any physical analogy we try to use, even the ice sculpture one, is going to break down eventually. You just can't perfectly explain the relationship between a totally transcendent creator and us, his relative creation, with something like water and ice. So how does it happen? Well, for the real answer, we turn to scripture. There is a verse in the Quran that says, basically, Indeed, his command, when he intends a thing, is only that he says to it, be, and it is. And that's the whole key right there. Creation isn't about shaping something that's already there. It's brought into existence with a simple, powerful command. So let's nail this down. The big takeaway is that we, and the whole universe, we aren't made from God's actual essence. We're not some piece of the divine that got broken off and shaped into something, like that ice sculpture. No, our existence is something else entirely. It's a direct expression of His divine will. And this quote really just says it all. It tells us that when you look at creation, you are not looking at God in any way, shape, or form. You're just seeing the result of His will. The source puts it so clearly. It is not at all a law from any direction. So, here we are, back at the beginning, but hopefully with a much clearer picture. We do exist, but it's a relative existence, one that's completely dependent on the one who is truly real. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If our existence is only relative, what does that really mean for our reality?
Have you ever really thought about that line between the creator and creation? It's a question that has fascinated mystics and philosophers for, well, centuries. Today, we're diving into a really profound concept where just one common misunderstanding can completely flip your entire view of the divine.
And it all kind of boils down to this one pretty startling question. There's a famous interpretation, often linked to the great mystic philosopher Ibn Arabi, that seems to say that whatever you worship is, in fact, God. But is that what he really meant? Or is it a huge misunderstanding? Let's get into it.
All right, so first, let's unpack this common confusion. This whole idea that whatever you worship is God often gets mixed up with a concept you've probably heard of called pantheism. At its heart, pantheism is the belief that there's no real gap between the divine and the universe. It's not just that the Creator is in every rock and every star. The Creator is the rock and the star. It's all made of the exact same divine stuff, the same essence. Okay, a really easy way to get this is with an analogy. The pantheistic view, that's like ice and water. Ice is just frozen water. It's the same substance, H2O, just in a different state. But think about another way to see it, a person and their reflection in a mirror. The reflection shows you the person for sure, but it is not the person. They are completely separate things. And this idea of separation, that's going to be the key to everything. So let's really dig into that mirror analogy. It's a super powerful way to build a completely different framework for understanding the relationship between the maker and what's been made.
And what's interesting is that even the idea of a mirror can work in two ways. You've got the literal one, right? A piece of glass that shows your face. But we also use it as a metaphor all the time. We might say a person's generous actions are a mirror of their kind character. Those actions aren't the person, but they point to who that person is inside.
In that right there, that's exactly the perspective we're digging into. From this viewpoint, creation is not a direct piece of God's essence. No, it's more like that second kind of mirror. It's an indirect sign. The incredible mountains, the oceans, the stars, they all point to the Creator's attributes, like His power, His beauty, His wisdom. But they aren't the Creator Himself.
And this brings us to the main event, the core concept that really solves this whole puzzle. It's a theological term that makes this critical distinction crystal clear. Tajalli.
So, what in the world is Tajalli? Well, as you can see, it's a term for the manifestation or the self-disclosure of God. You can think of it as the way the unseen Creator makes His qualities, like mercy, justice, or power, known to us in the physical world we can actually see and experience.
And here it is. This is the absolute heart of the whole idea. Tajalli is a manifestation of God's will, not His essence. This distinction is everything. Creation is something God willed into existence. It wasn't carved out of His own being. And that's so important because it keeps the Creator completely unique and separate.
So now you can see the two ideas side by side, and they're totally different. On one hand, you have pantheism, our ice and water idea, where creation is made directly from God's essence, making them one and the same. And on the other, you have Tajalli, our mirror idea, where creation is made indirectly through God's will. And that means the Creator and creation are and always will be separate.
Okay, so now that we have this powerful tool, this idea of will versus essence, let's go all the way back to that controversial interpretation of the Quranic verse that kicked this whole thing off.
The verse from Surah Al-Isra says,
and your Lord has decreed that you not worship except him. Now from this, some people have pulled out the meaning, whatever you worship is in fact God. And as we said, this reading is often pinned on Ibn Arabi.
But with everything we now know about Tajali, we have to ask, is that really what he meant? Did he truly believe that a statue, a star, or any other thing someone might worship is literally God?
And the answer, through this lens, is a clear no. See, the misinterpretation focuses on the object of worship, the what. But Ibn Arabi's real point, which fits perfectly with Tajali, is about the impulse to worship, the why. He's saying that deep down, every single human has this built-in natural drive to look for a higher power. In Islam, this is called the fitra, this original instinct to recognize and worship the one creator.
So, to put it all together, that deep-down impulse to worship is always, fundamentally, pointing towards the one true creator. But the physical action of worship can get aimed at the wrong thing, right? It can be misguided. And here's the kicker. Even though those objects, the statues, the stars, whatever, are still creations brought into being by God's will, they are not, and can never be, God himself. You know, to really let this idea sink in and stick, let's use one last metaphor. It's a really beautiful one that ties everything we've talked about together, the garden and its owner. Just picture it for a second. Imagine that the entire universe, everything you've ever known or could possibly imagine, is one single magnificent, sprawling garden. No matter where you go or what you do, you are always inside the walls of this garden. You eat its fruit, you drink from its rivers, you walk along its paths. Your whole reality is contained right here. And this whole garden, in its incredible complexity and beauty, is a stunning display. It's a Tajali of its owner's power, creativity, and will. Every single flower, every stream, every mountain tells you something about the one who designed and built it all. And here is the final, most important point. Admiring a flower, drinking from a stream, even getting lost in the beauty of the woods, that's an interaction with the garden. But it is not the same thing as interacting with the owner of the garden. The creation is always separate from the creator. So I'll just leave you with this question to chew on. How does this simple shift in thinking, from seeing the world as a piece of the divine to seeing it as a sign from the divine, change how we look at everything? It's the difference between worshiping the painting and letting the painting guide you to admire the artist. A small distinction maybe, but one that changes absolutely everything.